Tonight, we're traveling far back, not to a gilded palace, but to a dusty valley where two armies hold their breath. This is a story you think you know. David and Goliath, the small against the large. But we're going to look closer tonight, past the fairy tale version, to the grit, the terror, and the unshakable physics of faith. So, dim the lights. Let the valley fall silent. Let the champion roar. And let's see how David really defeated Goliath. Chapter 1. The Standoff in the Valley. The sun beat down upon the Valley of Elah, baking the dry, cracked earth into a vast, dusty plain that stretched between two opposing hills. For 40 days, the air had hung thick, not just with the heat, but with a palpable dread that choked the spirit of the Israelite army. Each morning and each evening, the ritual of fear repeated itself, a grim spectacle that left seasoned warriors trembling behind their shields. On one hill, the camp of the Philistines sprawled, a dark, confident stain against the landscape. On the other, the forces of King Saul huddled, their banners drooping in the still air, their resolve eroded by the towering figure who dominated the space between them. He emerged from the Philistine lines, as he always did, a mountain of a man clad in bronze that flashed like a malicious star. Goliath of Gath. His scale armor alone weighed more than a full-grown man, and the bronze greaves on his legs were like pillars. A javelin was slung across his back, its iron point a promise of death, and the shaft of his spear was as thick as a weaver's beam, carried before him by a shield-bearer who seemed a mere child in comparison. The giant's helmet obscured his face, but his voice needed no such aid. It was a weapon in itself, a thunderous roar that echoed off the valley walls. He strode to a clear patch of ground, planted his feet, and bellowed his challenge. The insults were not just aimed at the fighting men of Israel, but at their king, their heritage, and their God. He mocked their cowardice, questioned their manhood, and defied the armies of the living God to send forth a champion. The words, foul and blasphemous, rolled across the valley, each syllable a hammer blow against the morale of Saul's soldiers. They looked at one another, their faces pale, their hands slick with sweat on their spear shafts. They had seen the giant's power in demonstrations, knew the stories of his strength, and the king's reward of great wealth, his daughter's hand, and tax-free status for his family offered no comfort. The prize was a mirage. The reality was the 6 cubits and a span of hardened warrior standing before them, a living, breathing fortress of flesh and metal. The Israelite line, a bristling wall of shields and spears, just moments before, seemed to shrink inward. Men unconsciously took a step back, their eyes fixed on the monstrous figure. The silence from their ranks was a louder admission of defeat than any shouted retreat. There were no answering taunts, no brave volunteers stepping forward, only the sound of the wind whistling through the valley and the giant's mocking laughter, a sound that had become the soundtrack to their paralysis. The standoff was not a prelude to battle. It was a slow daily surrender, and the Valley of Elah had become a stage for the systematic dismantling of an army's soul, one terrifying dawn and one despairing dusk at a time. Chapter 2. David's Simple Life. Far from the oppressive tension of the Valley of Elah, in the gentle rolling hills surrounding Bethlehem, a different rhythm governed the days. Here the air was not filled with the echoes of curses and the clatter of arms, but with the soft bleating of sheep and the whisper of the wind through the grass. This was David's world, a domain of sun-warmed stone and quiet responsibility, where his only subjects were the woolly flock entrusted to him by his father, Jesse. His days began with the dawn, a solitary figure leading the sheep from their fold to the green pastures where they could graze. The rhythm was ancient and peaceful. As the flock spread out, nibbling contentedly at the dewy grass, David would take up his simple tools. His shepherd's staff was an extension of his arm, used to guide and correct, and his sling was never far from his hand. He practiced for hours, not with any thought of war, but with the focused intent of a craftsman honing his skill. Smooth, palm-sized stones collected from a nearby creek would fly from the leather pouch, whirring through the air to strike a specific knot on a distant tree or a lone, weathered stump with a satisfying thud. It was a meditation of motion, a dialogue between hand, leather, and stone. In the long, quiet hours of the afternoon, when the sun was high and the sheep rested in the shade of terebinth trees, David's voice would rise in song. They were not the marching songs of soldiers, but psalms of his own making, melodies woven from his heart and offered to the heavens. He sang of the steadfast love of the Lord, of green pastures and still waters, of a strength that was not his own. His faith was as practical as his sling, a living presence that filled the solitude. He remembered the times that faith had been tested, the sudden rush of a lion from a thicket, the shadow of a bear looming over a stray lamb. In those moments of terror, a calmness had settled over him, a certainty that the God who watched over the sparrows was with him in the wilderness. He had not fought with the strength of a warrior, but with the swift, sure faith of a shepherd protecting what was his, and each victory had been a stone laid upon the foundation of his trust. This simple, profound life of duty and devotion was interrupted one evening by the sound of his father's voice calling his name. Jesse's face was lined with worry, his thoughts with his 3 eldest sons who had followed King Saul to war. He had packed a parcel of food, roasted grain, loaves of bread and cheeses, sustenance for Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah. The journey to the front was long, and Jesse needed a messenger he could trust. He looked at his youngest son, saw not a boy, but the capable, faithful steward of his flocks. The request was simple. Take this food to your brothers, ensure they are well, and bring back news. For David, it was a break in the familiar routine, an errand of family duty. He accepted the parcel, his mind already turning to the path that led away from the peaceful hills of Bethlehem. He felt no premonition, no sense of destiny calling. He was simply a shepherd boy, his sling at his belt and a song in his heart, setting out on a journey to find his brothers, unaware that the simple faith cultivated in the quiet fields was about to be tested on the grandest stage imaginable. Chapter 3. The journey begins. The weight of the parcel was a new and unfamiliar burden. 10 loaves of bread, their crusts dark and hearty, a sack of parched grain that rustled with every step, and 10 portions of cheese carefully wrapped in cloth. These simple provisions felt heavy with more than just their physical mass. They were laden with a father's worry, a tangible connection to the 3 brothers whose faces David had not seen since they had marched away with King Saul. As the first light of dawn tinged the eastern sky with pale gold, David secured the supplies, his movements efficient and practiced, He slung the pouch over his shoulder, the familiar weight of his shepherd's staff, a comfort in one hand, his mind already tracing the route through the hills toward the Valley of Elah. Leaving the familiar pastures of Bethlehem behind, the world began to change. The gentle, cultivated slopes gave way to wilder, more rugged terrain. The path wound through rolling hills where the scent of thyme and wild mint rose from the earth, crushed under his sandals. He walked with the steady, ground-eating pace of one accustomed to long distances, his eyes scanning the landscape not for threats to his flock, but with a new burgeoning curiosity. His thoughts, once occupied solely with the welfare of sheep and the melody of a psalm, now turned to the grim reality of war. He tried to picture his brothers, Eliab, so stern and proud, Abinadab, with his quick laugh, Shammah, the quiet and steady one. Were they standing tall and brave among the king's men, or were they huddled in fear, as the stories from passing travelers suggested? The image of the giant Goliath was a vague and monstrous shape in his imagination, a storybook terror that seemed disconnected from the sun-dappled peace of the hills around him. Hours into his journey, the path dipped into a narrow valley, and the sound of water reached his ears, a clear musical gurgling that was a welcome reprieve from the dry heat. A small stream cut across his route, its waters dancing over smooth, rounded stones. Setting his staff and the parcel down on a mossy bank, David knelt, cupping his hands to drink. The water was cold and sweet, washing the dust from his throat. His gaze fell upon the stones lining the stream bed, each one worn smooth by the patient caress of the current. Instinctively, his fingers sought out a few that were perfectly round, fitting snugly in the palm of his hand. He stood, the familiar weight of a stone feeling right, and with a flick of his wrist, sent it skipping across the water's surface. It bounced once, twice, 3 times, before sinking with a soft plink into a deep pool. It was a simple, boyish act, but it was also a prayer. Each stone that skipped was a silent plea, a rhythm of faith against the unknown. He prayed for safe passage, for the well-being of his brothers, for the deliverance of Israel. He saw no grand vision, heard no divine voice. He felt only the sun on his back, the cool spray of the stream on his face, and the quiet assurance that had always been his companion in the fields. He was utterly unaware that the stones he selected with such casual practiced ease, the very tools of his humble trade, were being counted by a providence far greater than his own. He picked up his staff and the parcel of food, his heart light, his step sure, continuing his journey toward a destiny he could not yet conceive, a simple shepherd boy carrying bread for his brothers, soon to find that he carried the seeds of a nation's salvation. Chapter 4. Arrival at the camp. The first sight of the Israelite camp was not one of martial glory, but of a collective dread that seemed to stain the very air. David crested the final hill, his lungs burning from the climb, and looked down upon a scene that was utterly foreign to his pastoral soul. Where he had expected to see disciplined ranks and the proud banners of the tribes, he saw instead a huddled mass of men, their postures slumped, their eyes darting nervously toward the far side of the valley. The camp was a sprawling, disorganized affair of worn tents and smoky fires, and the silence that hung over it was heavier and more ominous than the loudest battle cry. It was the silence of fear, a palpable force that made the bread and cheese in his parcel feel like a pitiful offering against such profound despair. Picking his way through the outskirts of the encampment, David felt the stares of the soldiers. They were not the curious glances afforded a visitor, but the hollow, weary looks of men who had been broken by a terror they could not overcome. He saw groups of them clustered together, not in camaraderie, but in a shared anxiety, their voices low murmurs that were quickly swallowed by the vast, tense quiet. They spoke of the giant, not with anger, but with a resigned dread, their conversations punctuated by fearful glances toward the Philistine lines. David's own heart, so full of the peace of the hills, began to beat a little faster, a strange mix of pity and a burgeoning, uncomfortable curiosity stirring within him. He finally found them near the center of the camp, close to the larger, but no less weary, tents of the commanders. Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah were standing near a sputtering fire, their armor dusty, their faces etched with a fatigue that was more spiritual than physical. They did not see him approach. Their attention turned inward, their shoulders set against the world. When David called out a greeting, their heads snapped up, and the expressions that greeted him were not of welcome, but of immediate sharp-edged annoyance. Eliab, the eldest, his face a mask of frustration, was the first to speak, his voice a low, angry hiss. He scolded David for abandoning the few sheep, for leaving their father's livelihood unprotected to gawk at the army. He accused him of having a naughty heart, of seeking the excitement of the battlefront out of mere childish curiosity. Abinadab and Shammah stood by, their silence a tacit agreement, their eyes hard. The reunion David had imagined, the grateful acceptance of their father's gift, dissolved into the bitter air of the camp, replaced by the sting of their dismissal. They saw him not as a dutiful brother, but as an irresponsible boy, a nuisance in a place already overflowing with trouble. As their reprimands washed over him, David's attention was caught by the nervous whispers that flitted through the camp like ghosts. The name Goliath was on every tongue, spoken not as a challenge, but as a curse. He heard snippets of descriptions, the height of him, the weight of his armor, the thunder of his voice. He saw how men flinched at the sound of it, and in that moment, standing before his angry brothers, holding the simple provisions from home, David felt the first true stirrings of something other than duty or family concern. It was a sharp, piercing curiosity, a question that began to form in the core of his being, a question not born of fear, but of a faith that had been tested by lions and bears in the quiet of the wilderness. Why did this one man, this Goliath, hold such power over the army of the living God? Chapter 5. Goliath's daily taunt. The familiar, dreaded rhythm began just as the sun reached its zenith, a grim ceremony that cast a deeper shadow over the already despondent camp. From the Philistine lines, the giant emerged, a colossus of bronze and menace. The sun flashed off his scaled armor, each plate a malevolent mirror reflecting the fear of the watching Israelites. His helmet, with its dark plume, turned his head into an impersonal, terrifying mask, but the voice that roared from within it was horrifically human in its contempt. Goliath of Gath strode into the no-man's land with the arrogant, ground-eating steps of one who owned the very earth he walked upon, his shield-bearer a scurrying ant before him. He planted his feet, a posture of absolute dominion, and his challenge bellowed across the valley, a physical force that seemed to push against the Israelite ranks. The words were not new, but their blasphemy had not dulled with repetition. He mocked their cowardice, deriding them as slaves of Saul. He scorned their God, defying the armies of the living Lord of hosts. Each insult was a carefully aimed strike, designed not just to intimidate, but to systematically dismantle their identity, their faith, and their will. He offered his twisted bargain once more, a single champion to face him, the winner deciding the fate of both armies. And his laughter that followed was a corrosive sound, eating away at the last vestiges of their courage. The effect on the Israelite soldiers was immediate and visceral. It was not a retreat in formation, but a collective, unconscious recoil. Men who had stood firm moments before now shuffled backward, their shields dipping, their spears trembling. Their faces, already pale from days of this torment, went ashen. Eyes wide with a primal fear were fixed on the giant, unable to look away from the walking embodiment of their helplessness. The line, which had seemed a solid wall from a distance, now rippled with the motion of their fear, a wave of despair rolling back from the front. They knew the terms, they knew the king's rich reward, and they knew it was all a mirage. The reality was 9 feet of hardened killer, and the only prize was a swift and brutal death. David stood frozen, the argument with his brothers forgotten, the parcel of food hanging heavy and forgotten from his hand. He watched the giant's performance, heard the foul curses leveled against the name of the God he sang to in the fields. And as the soldiers around him shrank away, a heat began to bloom in David's chest, rising up his neck and flushing his face. It was not the heat of the sun, but a fire of pure, unadulterated anger. This was not the calculated risk of a lion stalking a lamb. This was a deliberate, sustained insult against the majesty of heaven itself. He looked from the cowering, seasoned warriors to the solitary giant shouting his defiance, and a profound, bewildered question solidified in his mind. Why? Why did no one answer? Why did the army of the living God allow this uncircumcised Philistine to mock them day after day? The faith that was as natural to him as breathing could not comprehend this paralysis. In the quiet of his soul, where he had faced predators with nothing but a sling and a prayer, the only response to such a challenge was action. Chapter 6. A boy's questions, the echo of Goliath's taunts, still seemed to vibrate in the very air, a foul residue clinging to the dust and the fear-dampened spirits of the men. David stood rooted to the spot, his heart hammering a rhythm of outrage that was entirely his own. The giant had withdrawn, his massive form receding back into the distant Philistine lines, but the shadow he cast was longer than any mountains, a psychological cage that held the entire Israelite army captive. David's eyes scanned the faces of the soldiers nearest to him. They were not the faces of warriors. They were the faces of haunted men, their expressions hollowed out by 40 days of relentless, unimpeded humiliation. He approached a small group of them, their shoulders slumped as they stared at the ground. Their armor was scuffed and dusty, their hands idle, their weapons looking more like burdens than tools of deliverance. David's voice, when he spoke, was clear and unafraid, cutting through their weary silence. He asked the question that burned in his soul, the one that made no sense in the world he knew. Why did they allow this? What was the reward offered to the man who would silence this defiance and remove this disgrace from Israel? He spoke not with accusation, but with a genuine, bewildered curiosity that seemed almost childlike in its simplicity. The soldiers looked at him, their eyes weary and patronizing. One of them, a grizzled veteran with a scar running down his cheek, gestured with a tired hand toward the now empty field where Goliath had stood. He spoke in low, measured tones, as if explaining a fundamental, terrible law of nature. He described the giant's size, not as a number, but as an overwhelming physical presence. He spoke of the weight of the bronze armor, a fortress that no ordinary sword could pierce. He detailed the sheer brute strength in the giant's arms, strength that could shatter a shield and the man behind it with a single blow. The king's rewards were meaningless, he explained, because the man did not exist who could collect them. The giant was not a man. He was a force of nature, an unstoppable engine of death, and the only sane response was to endure his insults and hope he grew bored. David listened, but the explanation did not settle the turmoil in his spirit. It fueled it. He shook his head, his youthful features set in a look of profound conviction. The words that came from his mouth were not his own invention. They were the bedrock of his existence, forged in the solitude of the fields. He did not speak of the giant's size or his armor. He spoke of the living God. Who was this uncircumcised Philistine, he asked, his voice gaining strength, that he should defy the armies of the living God? The emphasis was not on the armies, but on the God they served. In David's mind, the equation was simple, the scales irrevocably tipped. A man, no matter how large, was nothing before the Lord of hosts, who had delivered him from the paw of the lion and the bear. His brothers, who had been watching the exchange from a distance, their initial annoyance curdling into something darker, now strode over. Eliab's anger, always simmering near the surface, boiled over. He sneered at David, his voice dripping with contempt. He accused him of abandoning the sheep out of sheer wickedness and pride, of coming to the front merely to witness the bloodshed as if it were a spectacle. He mocked David's questions, his faith, his very presence, seeing it as an insult to their own inaction. But their scorn, meant to shame him and send him home, had the opposite effect. It was like a bellows on the fire already kindling in David's heart. As their mocking words washed over him, he felt not humiliation, but a strange and powerful clarity. The fear of the soldiers and the ridicule of his brothers were two sides of the same coin, a coin minted in a world that had forgotten the power of its God. And in that moment, standing small and seemingly insignificant in the vast, fearful camp, David felt a calling settle upon his shoulders, not as a heavy burden, but as a light that made everything else make sense. The question had been asked, and in the quiet of his soul, the answer was already being formed, a resolve as smooth and sure as the stones in his pouch. Chapter 7. The decision to act, the jeers of his brothers faded into the background hum of the camp, a meaningless noise against the roaring conviction now taking root in David's soul. He turned away from them, their scornful faces blurring as he sought a moment of solitude amidst the crowded fear. Finding a quiet space between two supply carts, he sank to his knees, the dry, packed earth cool beneath his palms. He closed his eyes, shutting out the sight of trembling soldiers and the distant, menacing Philistine lines. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he was back in the fields of Bethlehem, the air clean and filled with the scent of wildflowers and the soft sounds of his flock. His mind was a prayer, a silent, fervent conversation with the God of the still waters and the green pastures. He did not ask for strength or for victory, he remembered. Vividly, he recalled the tawny blur of the lion as it burst from the thicket, its roar a promise of rending flesh and shattered bone. He felt again the surge of adrenaline, not as fear, but as a channel for a power not his own. He saw his own hand, steady and sure, fitting a stone to his sling, his heart crying out not in terror, but in a declaration of trust. The memory was as real as the ground beneath him, the crack of the stone against the predator's skull, the limp weight of the creature as he rescued the lamb from its jaws. Then came the bear, a shaggy mountain of fury, its hot breath fogging the cold air as it rose on its hind legs. Again, the same calm certainty, the same swift, fluid motion, the same deliverance. These were not tales of his own bravery. They were monuments to a faithfulness that had never failed him. The God who walked with him in the quiet valleys was the same God whose name was being defiled in this dusty, fear-choked ravine. A profound peace settled over him, a resolution as solid and unshakable as the foundations of the earth. The giant's size, his armor, his threats, they were all illusions, shadows cast by a faithless heart. David's own heart, however, was full to overflowing with the truth that made Goliath seem small. He stood up, dusting the dirt from his tunic. His movements were calm, his gaze clear and focused. He walked back to where his brothers stood, their argumentative postures now seeming pitiful and small. He looked Eliab directly in the eye, his voice quiet, but carrying a weight that silenced the ambient noise of the camp. He told them he would go. He would face this Philistine. There was no boast in his tone, only a simple statement of fact, as if he were announcing his intention to fetch a stray ewe. For a moment there was stunned silence, and then it broke. Eliab's laughter was a harsh, disbelieving bark, quickly joined by the scornful chuckles of Abinadab and Shammah. They laughed until tears welled in their eyes, pointing at their youngest brother, this mere boy with a shepherd's staff who thought he could do what the entire army of Israel could not. They called him a fool, a madman, a disgrace. David stood firm under the barrage of their ridicule. He did not argue, did not try to justify himself further. Their laughter was like rain on stone, unable to penetrate the core of him. The fear that gripped the camp, the doubt in his brother's eyes, the sheer, overwhelming odds, none of it could touch the quiet fortress of his faith. He had made the decision. The journey from the peaceful fields to this moment of resolve was complete. He was no longer just a messenger boy or a curious younger brother. He was a vessel ready to be used, his simple sling and his 5 smooth stones, the instruments of a deliverance that had already been promised in the quiet moments of a shepherd's life. The laughter of his brothers faded into insignificance, a distant echo against the thunderous certainty now beating in time with his heart. Chapter 8. Meeting King Saul. The word spread through the camp like a spark through the dry tinder, leaping from one hushed group to the next. A boy, a mere shepherd, had declared he would fight the giant. It was a madness so profound it cut through the pervasive fear, creating a current of bewildered excitement. Soldiers pointed as David was led by a group of murmuring officers through the maze of tents, his shepherd's staff in hand, his face a mask of serene determination. They moved toward the center of the encampment, where the king's standard once a symbol of mighty authority, now hung limp and forlorn. Saul's tent was larger than the others, fashioned from heavy dark cloth, but it offered no impression of strength or comfort. It seemed instead to absorb the despair of the valley, a sagging monument to paralyzed leadership. The guards at the entrance, their armor polished but their eyes weary, parted to allow David and his escorts to pass. Inside, the air was thick and still, smelling of oiled leather and the faint, sour scent of anxiety. King Saul sat on a simple campaign stool, his broad shoulders slumped, his head bowed as if under an invisible, crushing weight. The crown of Israel rested uneasily on his brow, a circle of gold that seemed to hold more dread than honor. His fingers, thick and calloused from years of battle, worried the hem of his royal robe, a repetitive, nervous motion that betrayed the storm of helplessness raging within him. He looked up as David approached, and his eyes, shadowed by deep lines of exhaustion, registered a flicker of confusion. This was the volunteer? This youth whose face still held the softness of adolescence, whose frame was lean and hardened by outdoor labor, not the bulk of a warrior? David stood before him, not with the cowering posture of his soldiers, but with a quiet, unshakable stillness. He did not wait for a royal command to speak. His voice, when it came, was clear and resonant, filling the tense silence of the tent. He made his offer directly, without preamble or flattery. He would go and fight this Philistine Goliath. For a long moment Saul simply stared, his mind struggling to reconcile the enormity of the challenge with the simplicity of the boy who stood before him. Then a slow, weary shake of his head. A sigh, heavy with the weight of 40 days of failure, escaped his lips. His voice, when he finally spoke, was rough with strain and a paternal, almost pitying concern. He told David it was impossible. He was just a boy, a youth, while Goliath had been a man of war from his own youth. The king's gaze swept over David's simple tunic, his lack of armor, the shepherd's staff that was no spear. He saw only inexperience and a fatal naivete, a lamb volunteering for the slaughter. But as Saul spoke, his eyes remained locked on David's, and there, in the depths of the young shepherd's gaze, he saw something that made the words die in his throat. It was not the brash overconfidence of youth, nor the blank fear of his soldiers. It was a light, a steady, unwavering flame of absolute confidence that seemed to burn away the shadows of the tent. That light did not originate from David's own strength or skill. It shone with the reflected glory of a faith so complete, so unassailable, that it rendered the giant's threats irrelevant and the king's fears insignificant. In that moment, Saul, the troubled king who had once known the Spirit of the Lord, felt the faintest stirring of something he had thought lost, a fragile, desperate tendril of hope. The boy's quiet assurance was a truth so potent it momentarily silenced the voice of despair that had become Saul's constant companion. Chapter 9. Recounting the lion, the silence in the king's tent stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the distant muffled sounds of the fearful camp outside. Saul's gaze remained fixed on David, the king's own massive frame seeming to shrink under the weight of his doubt, while the young shepherd stood before him unbent and unafraid. David understood the king's hesitation, saw the calculation in his weary eyes, the measuring of a boy's slender frame against a giant's legendary might. But David's confidence was not rooted in his own physique. It was anchored in a history of divine deliverance written not on scrolls, but in the dust and danger of the wilderness. He began to speak, his voice calm and steady, weaving a tale that transported them both from the oppressive tent to the sun-drenched hills of Bethlehem. He painted a picture of a day like any other, the flock grazing peacefully on a steep, rocky slope, the air humming with insects and the gentle whisper of the wind. Then a sudden silence, a tension that prickled the skin, a low guttural growl that vibrated through the very ground. From behind an outcrop of rocks, a tawny shape exploded into motion, a full-grown lion, its muscles coiled like springs, its eyes burning with predatory hunger. It moved with terrifying speed, a blur of golden fur and lethal intent, its target a stray lamb that had wandered from the safety of the flock. The air filled with the panicked bleating of the sheep and the raw, primal scent of the predator. David did not describe a moment of fear, but one of instantaneous, fluid action. There was no time for hesitation, no room for doubt. As the lion closed its jaws around the lamb's hindquarters, dragging it toward the thicket, David was already moving. He remembered the feel of the dry earth under his sandals as he gave chase, the weight of his sling in his hand, the smooth, familiar shape of a stone finding its place in the leather pouch. He did not run away from the danger, but directly into its heart. The lion, distracted by its struggling prey, turned with a snarl, releasing the lamb to face this new threat. In that split second, as the beast lunged, David did the unthinkable. He dropped his sling and surged forward, his hands closing not on a weapon, but on the coarse, thick mane around the lion's neck. He described the sheer, raw power of the creature, the heat of its body, the rank blast of its breath. It was a force of nature, twisting and roaring, claws scrabbling in the dirt, trying to throw him off. But David held fast, his grip forged not in a smithy, but in a faith that made his hands strong. With a mighty heave, using the beast's own momentum, he wrestled it to the ground. The struggle was a whirlwind of dust and fury, a boy against a king of the wilderness. And as they rolled, David's free hand found his sling. In one continuous practiced motion, he loaded a stone and, with the lion's head pinned close, let it fly. The crack of stone on bone was a sharp, final sound. The mighty body went limp, the roaring ceased, and the only sound was David's own ragged breathing and the frantic bleating of the rescued lamb. He looked up from the memory, his eyes meeting Saul's once more. The point of the story was not his own bravery, his speed, or his strength. He emphasized this with a quiet intensity. It was the Lord who delivered him, he said, the same God who gave him the courage to run toward the lion, the strength to grasp its mane, and the surety to land the fatal blow. His own hand had been the Elah instrument, but the power had flowed from a source far greater than himself. He had been a shepherd protecting his flock, and God had been his shield and his strength. As the word settled in the tent, the image of the dead lion seemed to hang in the air between them, a tangible testament to a truth Saul had forgotten, that the battle was not won by the size of the warrior, but by the presence of the Lord. And in that moment, the king's skepticism began to crumble, replaced by the first fragile shoots of belief, as he looked at the boy before him and saw not a shepherd, but a vessel of divine power. Chapter 10. Recounting the bear, the memory of the slain lion still hung in the air of the tent, a testament to a power that defied human logic. But David was not finished. He saw the flicker of nascent hope in King Saul's eyes, a fragile ember that needed more fuel to become a flame. The lion had been one witness. There was another. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering, and began to weave a second story from the fabric of his past, a tale set in the colder, sharper air of the high country where the pastures thinned and the shadows of the pine trees grew long. He described a day when a bitter wind swept down from the mountains, carrying the scent of frost and wildness. The flock was nervous, huddling together for warmth, their bleats sharp with unease. He had been leading them to a sheltered valley when a sound cut through the wind, not the panicked cry of a lamb, but a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate up from the earth itself. From a thicket of gnarled, wind-bent trees, a massive shape emerged. It was a bear, its fur a shaggy, dark brown mantle, its eyes small, intelligent pits of hunger. It was larger and heavier than the lion, a creature of brute force and stubborn rage, built not for the swift chase, but for the overwhelming assault. The bear did not stalk. It simply charged, a rolling avalanche of muscle and fury, its target once again a lamb that had strayed too far from the flock's center. The ground seemed to tremble under its weight. David recalled the sheer, daunting bulk of the animal, the way it blotted out the light as it rose on its hind legs, taller than two men, its claws like curved daggers, and its roar a physical blow that stunned the air. It swiped a massive paw, snatching the lamb up with a casual, brutal efficiency, and began to turn, intending to drag its prize back into the impenetrable thicket to feed. There had been no time for the fluid wrestling of the lion. This was a different kind of threat, one that required distance and precision. David's hand went to his pouch, his fingers finding a stone as smooth and cold as ice. His movements were a prayer in motion, a seamless blend of practiced skill and absolute trust. He did not think of the bear's strength, its terrifying size, or the certain death those claws promised. He thought only of the lamb, of his duty, and of the God who held the breath of every living thing in his hands. As the bear turned its broad back to him, he swung his sling. The leather cords whirred, a humming song of faith in the thin mountain air. He released. The stone flew, a gray streak against the dark fur of the bear. It struck the beast square on the skull with a sound like an axe hitting wet wood. The bear staggered, a grunt of surprise and pain escaping its jaws. It dropped the lamb, which scrambled away, bleating in terror. The beast turned, its rage now a blinding, pain-fueled inferno. It focused its small, furious eyes on David and charged again, its gait clumsy but terrifyingly fast. David stood his ground, another stone already in his sling. He swung again, the motion as natural as breathing. This second stone found its mark with the same unerring accuracy, hitting the same spot on the bear's head. The massive creature stumbled, its charge faltering. It let out a final, wet, gurgling roar, then crashed to the earth, its great weight shaking the ground where David stood. He looked at Saul, the image of the fallen bear as vivid in the tent as the lion had been. The lesson was the same, but now reinforced, undeniable. "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear," David said, his voice quiet but ringing with absolute conviction. "He will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." He did not say might or could. He stated it as a fact, a law of the universe as certain as the sunrise. The giant in the valley was just another predator, another roar defying the peace of God's flock. And the same faithful shepherd, armed with the same simple tools and the same powerful God, would answer. In Saul's heart, the fragile ember of hope burst into a steady, burning flame. He was no longer looking at a boy. He was looking at an instrument of divine deliverance, and for the first time in 40 days, the king dared to believe that the nightmare in the valley might finally end. Chapter 11. Saul's agreement. The silence in the tent was no longer heavy with despair, but charged with a new electric potential. The echoes of David's stories, the slain lion and the felled bear, seemed to hang in the air, not as mere recollections, but as living testimonies of a power that transcended human strength. King Saul, a man whose spirit had been crushed by 40 days of relentless humiliation, felt the icy shell of his hopelessness begin to crack. He looked at the young shepherd standing before him, and for the first time he did not see a boy destined for a martyr's grave. He saw the unwavering faith in David's eyes, a faith that had turned wilderness predators into lifeless trophies, and he allowed himself to believe that the same faith could topple a giant. A profound shift occurred within the king, a surrender not to desperation, but to a possibility so audacious it bordered on the miraculous. The calculations of military logic, the assessments of size and armor, all fell away before the simple, overwhelming truth of David's conviction. This was not a gamble. It was an act of trust in the God he himself had once known so intimately. A slow, deliberate nod was his answer. The word, when it came, was soft but resonant with a king's restored authority. He agreed. David would go. He would face Goliath. But the king, moved as he was by faith, was still a father and a commander, and a deep, protective impulse surged within him. He could not send this brave youth out to face the Philistine champion, clad only in a simple tunic, armed with nothing but a shepherd's staff and a leather sling. He rose from his stool, his large frame suddenly animated by a purpose that had been absent for weeks. He called for his armor-bearer. Into the tent were brought the king's own royal battle gear, pieces that symbolized the pinnacle of Israel's martial might. There was a coat of mail, a heavy, finely woven tapestry of bronze scales that shimmered dully in the tent's dim light. It was a garment meant for a king, designed to turn aside the sharpest spear and the finest sword. Next came the helmet, a work of hammered bronze with a protective nose guard, its crest a mark of sovereign authority. With his own hands, Saul helped David into the armor. The bronze coat was immensely heavy, its weight an immediate foreign burden on David's shoulders, constricting the easy, fluid movements he relied upon. The helmet settled over his head, its rim cutting into his brow, limiting his vision and muffling the sounds of the world. Saul fastened the sword belt around David's waist, the heavy, ornate blade hanging awkwardly against his hip. The king stepped back, his eyes scanning the transformed figure before him. He saw a youth encased in the trappings of a warrior king, a smaller, slimmer reflection of himself. In that moment, Saul saw not just a volunteer, but a glimmer of divine possibility. He saw a vessel of faith now clad in the armor of a kingdom, a fusion of heavenly trust and earthly power that, he dared to hope, might be enough to shatter the chains of fear that bound his people. He looked at David, now armored in the king's own protection, and for a fleeting instant he believed he was looking at the answer to his prayers. a shepherd boy who might just become the Savior of Israel. Chapter 12. The Unwieldy Armor. The weight of kingship was a physical, suffocating reality. The bronze-scale mail, a masterpiece of the armorer's craft, felt less like protection and more like a prison forged of metal and expectation. As David stood clad in King Saul's own armor, the world narrowed to the crush of bronze on his shoulders and the constriction around his chest. Each scale, individually riveted, was a tiny, cold weight that together formed an immense, immovable burden. The helmet, a symbol of royal authority, was a bronze bowl that pressed down on his skull, its protective nose guard obscuring his peripheral vision and turning the familiar sounds of the camp into a dull, muffled roar. The sword belt, heavy with a blade meant for a king's hand, dragged at his hip, an awkward, clumsy counterweight to his natural balance. He took a tentative step forward. The movement was not the fluid, ground-sure stride of a shepherd, but a clumsy, stilted shuffle. The armor did not move with him. It resisted him, its rigid form fighting the subtle shifts of his body. He tried to lift his arms, to mimic the practiced swing of his sling, but the scaled sleeves bit into his flesh, limiting his reach, turning a motion of graceful precision into a labored, wooden gesture. He felt like a sapling trying to bear the weight of a mountain. The very tools of war that were meant to empower him instead rendered him powerless. A boy playing dress-up in a suit of metal that belonged to a different world, a different kind of battle. Another step, and he stumbled. His foot, accustomed to reading the subtle contours of the earth through the thin soles of his sandals, now felt nothing but the unyielding inner surface of a bronze greave. He lost his balance, lurching forward, his arms pinioned by the heavy mail, failing to break his fall. He crashed to the packed earth of the tent floor with a discordant clatter of metal, a jarring impact that drove the air from his lungs. Lying there, encased in the king's grandeur, he felt a profound and certain truth crystallize in his mind. This was not his way. This armor, for all its impressive craftsmanship and symbolic power, was a lie. It was a declaration of dependence on human strength, on forged metal and royal privilege, and it hindered the very thing that had always been his true defense, the freedom to move in the flow of God's Spirit. With a grunt of effort, he pushed himself up onto his knees, his fingers, familiar with the feel of wool and leather and smooth stone, fumbled with the unfamiliar clasps and buckles of the royal gear. He worked with a quiet, determined urgency, shedding the weight of kingship as a snake sheds its skin. First, the helmet came off, and the world rushed back in, the clear air, the unencumbered view. Then the coat of mail, its heavy scales sloughing away from his body, with a final metallic sigh, pooling on the ground in a shimmering, discarded heap. Lastly, he unbuckled the sword, letting the king's blade fall beside the rest. Standing once more in his simple tunic, he felt a lightness return to his spirit, a reconnection with the self he knew and the God he trusted. He picked up his shepherd's staff, its worn wood a familiar comfort in his hand. He touched the leather pouch at his belt, feeling the absence of stones and knowing with unwavering certainty what he must do. The answer was not in the royal armory, but in the simple, faithful tools of his calling. He would face the giant not as a pseudo-king, but as what he was, a shepherd armed with a staff, a sling, and 5 smooth stones from the stream. It was a decision, born not of pride, but of profound self-knowledge and an absolute trust in the deliverance that had never, ever failed him. Chapter 13. Selecting the Stones. The stream was a silver thread stitching through the rugged landscape, its gentle murmur a stark contrast to the tense silence of the camp behind him. David walked toward it with a purposeful stride, the weight of Saul's discarded armor replaced by the lightness of a familiar calling. The air by the water was cooler, carrying the clean scent of wet stone and damp earth. He knelt on the bank, the rough fabric of his tunic brushing against the mossy stones, and let his gaze drift over the stream bed. Here the world was reduced to its simplest elements, the clear flowing water, the sun-warmed rocks, and the quiet hum of creation. It was a sanctuary, a place for preparation, not with the clamor of the forge, but with the silence of prayer. His fingers, calloused and sure, dipped into the cool water, sifting through the gravel and sand. He was not looking for jagged, impressive stones, nor the largest he could find. His search was for perfection of a different kind. His touch sought out stones that were smooth, worn to a gentle roundness by the patient, ceaseless flow of the water over countless seasons. Each one he selected was tested in the palm of his hand, its weight and balance judged by an instinct honed over 10,000 throws. 1, 2, 3, 4. Each smooth gray sphere was a choice made with deliberate care, a selection as sacred as any priestly ritual. The fifth and final stone felt particularly right, its surface like polished marble, its weight a perfect counterpoint to the swing of his sling. He dropped it into his leather pouch with the others, the soft clack of stone against stone, a sound of readiness. He stood, the 5 stones, a comfortable, familiar weight at his hip. He untied his sling from his belt, the worn leather supple and trusted in his grasp. He loaded one of the smooth stones, his movements fluid and unconscious, a dance his muscles knew by heart. He began to swing it, slowly at first, then faster, the chords whirring in a low resonant hum that cut through the babble of the stream. It was not a test of strength, but a communion. With each rotation he felt not the strain in his arm, but a presence settling around him as tangible as the sunlight. It was the same presence that had walked with him in the fields of Bethlehem, that had steadied his hand against the lion and guided his stone against the bear. Here, by the stream, with the simple tools of his trade, there was no fear, no doubt, only a profound and peaceful certainty. The giant was a problem of men. The solution was here, in the smooth stones and the whirring sling, in a heart that beat in time with a faith that moved mountains. His preparation was complete, not in the clang of metal, but in the quiet selection of 5 smooth stones and the unwavering knowledge that the battle was already the Lord's. Chapter 14. Marching to Battle. The moment his sandals left the soft, damp earth of the stream bank and met the hard-packed, sun-baked ground of the valley approach, the world seemed to shift. The sanctuary of the flowing water and the whispered prayers were behind him now, replaced by the stark, open expanse that led to the giant. David walked forward, his shepherd's staff a steadying presence in his hand, the pouch with its 5 smooth stones tapping gently against his thigh with each step. He did not run, nor did he creep. His pace was measured, deliberate, the same steady gait he used when moving his flock from one pasture to another, a rhythm of purpose that was deeply ingrained in his being. A ripple of movement passed through the Israelite ranks as he emerged from the periphery of the camp. The sea of fearful faces, which had been turned inward in despair, now swiveled toward him. A low murmur began, a wave of disbelief and astonishment that grew in volume as more and more soldiers saw the solitary figure walking toward the valley floor. They saw no polished bronze armor, no royal helmet, no heavy sword. They saw only a youth in a simple tunic, a staff in his hand, and a leather pouch at his belt. Some of the men, their spirits crushed for so long, felt a strange, desperate hope kindle in their chests. A few ragged cheers broke out, voices hoarse with disuse, shouting blessings, invoking the name of the God of Jacob. They saw not a boy, but a symbol, a defiance of the fear that had held them captive, but for every cheer there were a dozen looks of stark doubt, of pitying shakes of the head. Seasoned warriors, their faces lined with the scars of countless battles, watched him pass with expressions of grim resignation. They saw a lamb walking willingly to the slaughter, a tragic, foolish spectacle that only underscored their own helplessness. Whispers of madness and suicide trailed in his wake like bitter smoke. They saw his slender frame, his lack of any conventional weapon, and they could not reconcile it with the monstrous reality of the Philistine champion. Their doubt was a cold, tangible force, but it washed over David without finding purchase. Inside, David's heart was a wild drum against his ribs, a frantic, physical echo of the moment. The sheer scale of what he was doing pressed in on him. The vastness of the valley, the thousands of eyes upon him, the knowledge of the colossal warrior waiting in the distance. It was a weight that threatened to crush his spirit. But with each step, he consciously turned his focus inward, away from the staring eyes and the murmuring voices, away from the looming specter of Goliath. He focused on the promise, not as a distant theological concept, but as a living, breathing reality. He remembered the feel of the lion's mane in his grip, the sound of the bear crashing to the earth, the cool smoothness of the stones in his pouch. He felt the same presence that had been with him in the quiet fields, now walking beside him in this place of terror. His pounding heart did not slow, but its rhythm changed, sinking not with fear, but with a steadfast, unwavering faith. He was not marching to his death. He was walking into the fulfillment of a deliverance he had already experienced, a shepherd answering the call to defend his father's flock once more. Chapter 15. Goliath's Rage. From the Philistine lines, a mountain of bronze and fury stirred. Goliath's massive form, which had been a stationary monument to terror, now shifted with a low grinding sound of metal on metal. His shield-bearer scurried ahead, a nervous attendant to the coming storm, but all eyes, both fearful and hopeful, were fixed on the giant himself. He had seen the movement from the Israelite camp, the ripple of attention centered on a single advancing figure. At first, it was a curiosity, a break in the monotonous ritual of cowardice. But as the figure drew nearer, emerging from the dust and distance, the giant's confusion curdled into something far more volatile. This was no seasoned champion, no armored hero emerging to answer his challenge. This was a boy, a lean, unarmored youth carrying nothing but a shepherd's staff. A sound began deep within Goliath's chest, a low rumble that grew in volume until it erupted into a roar of disbelief and contemptuous laughter. The sound was not human. It was the derisive bellow of a god mocking the futility of men, a thunderclap of scorn that rolled across the valley and silenced the scattered cheers from the Israelite ranks. He took a heavy step forward, the ground seeming to tremble under his weight, his polished armor flashing in the sun like a malicious wink. He planted his feet, his immense frame blocking out the sky, and pointed a bronze-gauntleted finger at the approaching David, his laughter dissolving into words that were as sharp and cruel as the point of his javelin. He cursed David by his own gods, invoking Dagon and Ashtaroth with foul oaths that polluted the air. His voice, a weapon honed by 40 days of intimidation, dripped with venomous mockery. He called David a dog, a stick boy, a pathetic excuse for a warrior sent by a kingdom of cowards. The threats that followed were graphic and brutal, promises of a specific, humiliating death. He would tear the boy limb from limb, he roared, and feed his flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. His words painted a visceral picture of carrion and desecration, each syllable designed to shatter nerve and bone before a single blow was ever struck. He was not just threatening an opponent, he was dismantling a symbol, proving once and for all that the God of Israel was powerless against the might of the Philistine war machine. But as the giant's fury crashed over him, a wave of pure, hateful sound, David did not flinch. He did not slow his steady, deliberate pace. He did not raise his staff in a defensive posture or fumble for a stone in his pouch. He simply kept walking, his eyes fixed not on the gnashing teeth or the shaking fist, but on the space beyond the giant, on the promise that burned in his heart. The insults meant to paralyze him seemed to dissolve before they could touch his spirit, their power nullified by a quiet, unassailable truth that rendered the giant's rage nothing more than noise. The fear that had gripped an entire army found no purchase on the young shepherd. He stood firm in the eye of the hurricane of hatred, a solitary rock in a raging sea, his calmness a more profound defiance than any shouted challenge. The giant's rage was immense, a force of nature, but David's faith was the bedrock upon which that force broke and scattered, useless and unheeded. Chapter 16, David's bold reply. The giant's roar of contempt still hung in the air, a foul mist of blasphemy and threat, but it was met not with cowering silence or a trembling retreat. David stopped his advance, planting his staff firmly in the dry soil of the valley floor. He stood small and seemingly insignificant before the bronze-clad colossus, a sapling facing a tempest. Yet, when he lifted his head and raised his voice, it carried not the shrill pitch of fear, but the clear, resonant tone of absolute conviction. It was a sound that cut through the echoes of Goliath's mockery, a sharp, clean blade of truth in the polluted air. He did not answer the giant's curses with curses of his own. He did not boast of his own skill or his past victories. Instead, he named the true combatants in the conflict, redefining the battle for every ear that heard him, from the trembling Israelite soldiers to the smug Philistine ranks. He declared that he came not in his own name, not in the name of King Saul, but in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel. He threw the giant's own defiance back at him, not as an insult, but as a statement of fact. This was the God whom Goliath had taunted and reviled for 40 days, the living God whose authority the Philistine had treated as a meaningless echo. Then David pronounced the giant's fate with the calm certainty of a prophet reading from an already written scroll. He declared that on this very day the Lord would deliver Goliath into his hand. He spoke of the coming victory not as a possibility, but as an inevitability, a divine transaction that was already complete in the heavenly realms. He described the outcome with stark, vivid imagery, the striking down of the giant, the severing of his head, and the delivery of the Philistine army into the hands of Israel. But the purpose of this victory, he made clear, was not for his own glory or even for the salvation of the army. It was so that all the earth would know that there was a God in Israel. It was a lesson for the assembled nations, a demonstration that the battle belonged not to the strong or the well-armed, but to the Lord. His words hung in the sudden, stunned silence, a proclamation that transformed the very nature of the conflict. This was no longer a contest between a boy and a giant, between a sling and a spear. It was a spiritual showdown, a confrontation between defiant human pride and the sovereign power of heaven. David, armed with nothing but a leather pouch and a staff, had not advanced to meet a warrior. He had come to confront an insult to his God, and he did so with the unshakable faith of one who knew the outcome was not in doubt. The entire valley seemed to hold its breath, the thousands of watching men realizing they were not spectators to a duel, but witnesses to a testimony. The true weapons were not made of bronze or stone, but of faith, and the boy standing alone on the field had just revealed himself to be the most powerfully armed person present. Chapter 17. The sling, readied, the final defiant echo of David's proclamation, seemed to suck all sound from the Valley of Elah, leaving a vacuum of breathless anticipation. In that suspended silence, where fear and hope warred in the hearts of thousands, David moved. It was not the cautious advance of a warrior sizing up his foe, nor the reckless charge of a fanatic. It was the fluid, purposeful motion of a shepherd closing in on a predator threatening his flock. He dropped his staff, its familiar weight abandoned on the dusty ground, for his hands now had a more urgent task. His right hand dipped into the leather pouch at his belt, his fingers, guided by an instinct honed over countless hours in the fields of Bethlehem, finding one of the 5 smooth stones. It was cool and perfectly round, a dense, compact promise of force nestled in his palm. In one continuous, practiced motion, he loaded the stone into the cradle of his sling. The worn leather felt like an extension of his own flesh, the cords familiar and trusted. He began to swing it, not with a wild, frantic energy, but with a calm, controlled rhythm that spoke of absolute mastery. The sling whirred to life, a low, resonant hum that cut through the tense silence, a sound as ancient as the hills themselves. It was the song of the shepherd, the same song that had sung the lion and the bear to their rest, now directed at a giant of a different kind. With each rotation, the stone gained momentum, a captive star orbiting the steady center of David's will. His eyes, sharp and focused, were locked not on the giant's roaring mouth or his gleaming armor, but on a single, small patch of unprotected skin on the massive forehead, a target that seemed to grow larger and more distinct with every beat of his heart. He ran now, his body leaning forward into the motion, his feet kicking up puffs of pale dust. He was a blur of focused intent, closing the distance with a terrifying, graceful speed. The armies on both sides of the valley watched, utterly transfixed. In the Israelite camp, men leaned forward, their knuckles wide on their spear shafts, their mouths agape. The few ragged cheers had died, replaced by a silent, desperate prayer that seemed to rise from the very earth. In the Philistine ranks there was first mocking laughter, which quickly faltered and died as they saw the unnerving certainty in the boy's movements, the lack of any hesitation. The giant himself, Goliath, momentarily paused his bluster, a flicker of confusion crossing his features at this bizarre, unorthodox attack. He had expected a sword thrust, a spear cast, not this whirring, running approach from a slinger. The moment stretched, thin and taut as a drawn bowstring. Every breath was held, every muscle frozen. The entire world had narrowed to the whirring sling, the running boy, and the towering giant, all waiting for the release, for the stone to fly and shatter the unbearable tension. Chapter 18. The fatal strike. The stone left the sling not as a mere projectile, but as a streak of gray lightning, a silent, focused answer to 40 days of blasphemy and fear. It flew with an unerring trajectory, a perfect line drawn by faith and a shepherd's practiced hand, crossing the space between David and the giant in a heartbeat. There was no sound of its flight, only the sudden, sickening crack of impact as it found its mark. The smooth, round stone, chosen with such deliberate care from the stream, struck Goliath square in the center of his forehead, right between the eyes, on the very flesh he had left arrogantly unprotected. For a single, suspended moment, nothing happened. The giant stood, his massive frame a bronze monument against the sky, his mouth still open mid-curse. A look of profound, uncomprehending shock flooded his features. The bluster and rage wiped away in an instant and replaced by a blank animal confusion. The force of the blow had not merely struck him, it had short-circuited the very engine of his being. The vibrations traveled through his skull, a thunderclap inside his own head that silenced the world. His eyes, which had burned with contempt, glazed over, seeing nothing. The immense power that had fueled his terrifying presence simply switched off. Then the colossal structure began to fail. His knees, like great tree trunks, buckled. The giant swayed, a mountain succumbing to a seismic shift from within. A low groan, the last vestige of air escaping his lungs, rumbled from his chest. He teetered forward, his balance utterly lost, his arms hanging limp at his sides. The heavy javelin slipped from his gauntleted fingers, clattering uselessly to the ground. With a slow, inexorable finality, the great mass of Goliath of Gath pitched forward. He fell not with a dramatic, twisting collapse, but with the simple, crushing weight of a felled oak. His face, the face that had snarled so many insults, slammed into the dust of the Valley of Elah with a dull, earth-shaking thud that seemed to vibrate through the soles of every watching soldier's feet. A small cloud of pale dust plumed around his head, then settled, leaving the bronze helmet askew and the giant motionless. An absolute, deafening silence descended upon the valley. It was a silence more profound than any that had come before, a vacuum of sound so complete it felt like a physical pressure on the eardrums. On the Israelite side, 10,000 men stood frozen, their minds refusing to process the impossible sight before them. The giant was down. The unchallenged, unstoppable terror of their lives lay face down in the dirt, felled by a single stone from a shepherd's sling. Their fear, a constant companion for so long, had been so central to their existence that its sudden absence was a shock in itself. They stared, unblinking, their weapons hanging forgotten in their hands, their breath caught in their throats. The world had just been upended, and in the heart of that staggering silence, a new alien emotion began to stir, the first tentative flicker of a hope they had long since abandoned. Then, as if a dam had burst, the silence shattered. A single ragged cry of disbelief and triumph rose from the Israelite ranks, and it was all the catalyst that was needed. The sound that erupted next was not a cheer, but a roar, a primal collective release of 40 days of pent-up terror, shame, and desperation. It was a wave of sound that tore through the valley, a thunderous, joyous explosion of faith restored and deliverance witnessed. Men who had been paralyzed by fear moments before now leaped into the air, shouting, weeping, embracing one another, their voices merging into a single, triumphant cry that praised the name of the Lord. The camp of Israel, so long a place of despair, erupted into a chaotic, glorious celebration, their eyes fixed on the small, solitary figure standing over the fallen giant, the boy who had turned their terror into triumph with a single, faithful stone. Chapter 19, Victory Confirmed. The roar of the Israelite camp was a distant, thunderous wave, but for David, the world had narrowed to the still, massive form lying in the dust before him. The giant was down, but the defiance was not yet fully extinguished, the insult not yet completely answered. The stone had done its work, a silent, precise strike that had felled the mountain of bronze and pride, but the victory required confirmation, a sign so undeniable it would shatter the spirit of the enemy. David's heart hammered not with fear now, but with a fierce, focused urgency. He did not pause to savor the shock of the armies or the burgeoning celebration behind him. His eyes were fixed on Goliath, on the great sword sheathed at the giant's hip, the very symbol of the Philistines' threat. He ran forward, his sandals scuffing through the dry soil, closing the final distance to the fallen champion. The giant's body was a landscape of polished metal and leather, a fallen fortress. Up close, the scale of him was even more overwhelming, a testament to the sheer impossibility of what had just occurred. David's gaze did not linger on the bronze helmet or the massive, limp hands. It went directly to the sword, its hilt ornate, its blade longer than David was tall, a weapon designed for a hand that could crush stone. He knelt, his own hands accustomed to the gentle grip of a staff and the smooth weight of a stone, closing around the giant's hilt. The metal was cold and unfamiliar, the grip too large for his hand, but he tightened his fingers with a resolve forged in the fires of his faith. With a grunt of effort, he pulled. The blade slid from its scabbard with a soft metallic whisper that seemed deafening in the intimate space between the victor and the vanquished. The weight of it was immense, a dead, brutal heaviness that strained his arm. He did not need it to fight. He needed it to testify. Positioning himself, he raised the giant's own sword high above his head, the polished iron catching the sun and flashing a single, brilliant signal across the valley. Then, with one clean, powerful stroke, he brought it down. The act was swift and decisive, the final graphic period at the end of David's bold proclamation. The giant's head, severed from the body that had terrorized a nation, was his. He staggered for a moment under the grisly weight, then found his balance. Turning to face the Philistine army, he bent his knees, and with a surge of strength that felt both his and not his own, he hoisted the head high. He held it aloft by the hair, a terrible, undeniable trophy. The sight was meant for them. The bronze helmet was gone, the face now a pale, slack-jawed mask of extinguished fury, a clear and horrifying confirmation of the impossible. The champion of Gath, the invincible, the defiant, was not merely wounded or stunned. He was dead, defeated by a boy, and his own sword had been the instrument of his final disgrace. For a long, frozen moment, the Philistine ranks simply stared, their minds refusing to accept the evidence before their eyes. The celebration on the opposite hill, the boy holding their hero's head, the head itself, it was a cascade of impossibilities. Then the paralysis broke. A single high-pitched scream of pure, undiluted terror ripped from 1,000 throats at once. The sight of their champion's severed head, held high by the young shepherd, was a psychological blow more devastating than any military defeat. The foundation of their confidence, the bedrock of their arrogance, crumbled into dust. The giant who had been their shield and their spear was gone, and in his place stood only a terrifying divine judgment they could not comprehend. The disciplined lines of the Philistine army dissolved in an instant, dissolving into a chaotic, mindless scramble of panicked men. The victory was confirmed not by a flag or a treaty, but by the ghastly prize in David's hand and the contagious, soul-shattering panic that now swept through the enemy camp like a plague. Chapter 20. The Philistine Flight. The sight of their champion's head, pale and lifeless in the grip of the young shepherd, acted like a spark thrown onto dry tinder. The single scream of terror that had erupted from the Philistine ranks became a chorus, then a cacophony, a symphony of pure, undiluted panic that swallowed the last vestiges of their battle discipline. The giant had been more than a warrior. He had been their icon of invincibility, a living talisman whose presence guaranteed victory. With him fallen, and in so shocking and humiliating a manner, the very foundation of their reality crumbled. The confidence that had allowed them to posture and taunt for 40 days evaporated, replaced by a primal, mindless fear that recognized only the instinct for survival. Their orderly lines, which had stood as a dark, menacing wall against the Israelite camp, disintegrated into a chaotic, seething mass of fleeing men. Bronze helmets were torn off and discarded, heavy shields dropped to the dust to lighten the frantic escape. Spears and javelins, once symbols of their martial pride, were cast aside like worthless twigs. There was no formation, no organized retreat toward their own territory. It was a stampede, a blind, desperate scramble away from the valley and the terrifying boy who had, with a single stone, unmade their world. They tripped over each other, their armor clattering, their voices raised in incoherent cries of alarm, their eyes wide with the terror of a judgment they could not understand. The mighty army of the Philistines was reduced to a river of fear, flowing back toward its own borders in a disordered, shameful flood. From the Israelite camp, the transformation was just as swift and just as profound. The stunned silence that had followed Goliath's fall shattered into a roar of unleashed triumph. The fear that had paralyzed them for weeks was gone, burned away in the furnace of this miraculous victory. A new energy, fierce and jubilant, coursed through their ranks. They saw the Philistine panic, saw the backs of their tormentors, and a collective battle cry rose from 10,000 throats, a sound of pure, vengeful exultation. They did not wait for a command from King Saul. As one body, they surged forward, a wave of righteous fury crashing down from their hill. They poured into the valley, their swords and spears now gleaming with purpose, their shouts not of fear, but of praise to the God of Israel. They chased the fleeing Philistines, their footsteps pounding a rhythm of deliverance into the very earth that had witnessed their shame. The valley, so long an echo chamber for Goliath's taunts, now resonated with a different sound, the sounds of victory and retreat, of triumphant shouts mingling with terrified screams, of the relentless pursuit of a broken enemy. The Israelites harried them all the way to the gates of Goth and Ekron, their faith now a tangible force, their courage forged in the fire of a shepherd's faith. The road was littered with the discarded armor and weapons of the Philistines, the spoils of a battle won not by human strength, but by the power of a living God, a truth that echoed in every shout of praise and every panicked cry of the defeated. Chapter 21. Celebrating the Hero. The return to the Israelite camp was not a walk, but a triumphal procession that swept David up in a current of raw, ecstatic joy. He moved through a sea of exultant faces, the grisly trophy of Goliath's head still held firmly in his grasp, a stark and undeniable proof of the miracle they had all witnessed. The soldiers, who had hours before trembled behind their shields, now surrounded him, their fear transmuted into a fervent, almost worshipful adoration. They pressed in close, not to threaten, but to touch him, to assure themselves that this deliverer was real, his hands still smeared with the dust of the valley and the grim evidence of his victory. Their voices rose in a spontaneous, thunderous chorus of song and dance, a rhythmic, pounding celebration that shook the very ground. They sang not of David, but of the God he served, their psalms of thanksgiving weaving through the chaotic, joyful noise, their feet kicking up clouds of dust that glittered in the late afternoon sun like holy incense. Through the roaring crowd, King Saul emerged, his royal robes a splash of color amid the sea of common tunics. The weight of kingship, which had bowed his shoulders for 40 days, seemed to have lifted. His face, so recently etched with lines of despair and anxiety, was transformed, alight with a relief so profound it was close to tears. He strode forward and embraced David, pulling the young shepherd into a crushing, paternal hug. The gesture was one of profound gratitude, of a king acknowledging the Savior of his people. Saul's voice, when he spoke into David's ear, was thick with emotion, praising his courage and blessing the God of Israel. For a moment it was a perfect picture of unity, the grateful king and the heroic youth, the symbol of established power embracing the instrument of divine deliverance. But as Saul pulled back, his hand still on David's shoulders, his eyes scanned the faces of the celebrating soldiers. He saw the way they looked at David, not with the respectful deference owed to a king, but with a blazing, fervent devotion usually reserved for prophets and liberators. They chanted David's name, their eyes following his every move with a zeal that bypassed the throne entirely. They saw in him not a subject, but a champion, a legend born in a single afternoon. And in the heart of King Saul, a cold, sharp sliver of unease pierced the warm bubble of his relief. The adoration of the people was a heady wine, and he saw it being poured not for him, the Lord's anointed, but for this ruddy youth from Bethlehem. A shadow, subtle and dark, flickered across his face, the first faint stirring of a jealousy that would one day curdle into obsession. The embrace ended, and Saul stepped back, his smile still fixed in place, a kingly mask now hiding a sudden, gnawing worry that the very deliverance he celebrated might have planted the seed of his own undoing. Chapter 22. Saul's Hidden Worry. The celebration was a roaring fire, and David was its brilliant, blinding center. Saul stood at the periphery of the jubilant throng, his smile a carefully carved mask of royal approbation. But his eyes, sharp and calculating, missed nothing. He watched as soldiers who had flinched at his commands now jostled to clap David on the back, their laughter booming with a freedom that had been absent from his camp for 40 days. He saw the way their gazes followed the young shepherd, not with the obligated respect due to a king, but with a raw, fervent admiration that was both intoxicating and deeply unsettling. Each cheer for David's name was a subtle erosion of his own authority, a quiet shift in the loyalty of the army he was meant to command. Beneath the mask, a cold dread began to uncoil in the pit of Saul's stomach. It was an old fear, one he had tried to bury beneath years of battle and kingship. The memory, long suppressed, now surfaced with the clarity of a shard of ice. The words of the prophet Samuel, spoken in condemnation after his disobedience at Amalek. The kingdom would be torn from him, Samuel had declared. The Lord had sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler over his people. Saul had clung to his throne, hoping the prophecy was a vague threat, a warning to be heeded, not a fate already sealed. But now, watching this boy from Judah, this shepherd who moved with an unshakable faith he himself had lost, the prophecy felt less like a warning and more like a manifesting destiny. Every honor heaped upon David was a hammer blow on the anvil of that prophecy. The way David held himself with a humble grace that made Saul's own royal bearing feel like a hollow performance, the effortless courage that stood in stark contrast to his own paralyzed fear, the clear, untroubled faith that connected David to the divine in a way Saul could no longer access. This was no ordinary soldier. This was the man after God's own heart. The realization was a poison, seeping into his veins, turning the sweet wine of victory into a bitter draught. He saw the future unfolding in the adoring eyes of his men, a future where this youth, not the son of Kish, would wear the crown of Israel. He watched David accept the praises of the people, his head bowed not in false modesty, but in genuine deference to the God who had won the battle. The gesture, so pure, felt like an accusation to Saul's troubled spirit. A hot, sharp spike of jealousy, ugly and possessive, lanced through him. This boy had not only slain a giant, he had exposed the king's own spiritual poverty. The threat was not just to his throne, but to his very legacy. Yet Saul was a king, a politician, a man who knew the value of appearances. He forced his smile wider, nodded his head in approval, and raised his own voice in public praise for the hero of Israel. He clapped his hands, the sound lost in the tumult, and called for more feasting, more celebration. He would hide this gnawing anxiety behind a fortress of royal benevolence, all the while watching, waiting, and calculating. The giant in the valley was dead, but a new, more insidious threat had just been born in the heart of the king, a hidden worry that would fester in the shadows of his smile, setting the stage for a conflict far more complex and personal than any battle against the Philistines. Chapter 23. David's Rising Fame. The celebration in the camp was merely the first ripple in a pond, the initial tremor before the earthquake of renown. The story of the shepherd boy and the giant did not simply travel. It exploded across the hills and towns of Israel, carried by soldiers returning to their homes, by merchants on dusty roads, by the wind itself. It was a tale too potent to be contained, a narrative of divine reversal that captured the imagination of a nation starved for hope. In city gates and village squares, around cooking fires and in synagogues, the name of David was on every tongue, spoken with a reverence usually reserved for the great judges and prophets of old. The victory was not his, he insisted whenever he could, but God's. Yet the people, in their need for a hero, fastened their adoration upon the vessel. Nowhere was this adoration more vividly expressed than in the songs of the women. They came out from the cities to meet King Saul, their ranks swelling as his victorious army journeyed homeward. They were not a formal choir, but a spontaneous eruption of national joy. Their voices clear and high, weaving intricate harmonies of triumph. They danced with timbrels and with joy, their colorful robes swirling, their faces alight. And the song they sang, a simple, catchy refrain, was a dagger to the heart of a king. Saul has slain his thousands, they chanted, their voices sweet and celebratory, and David his tens of thousands. The first line was an acknowledgment, a respectful nod to the king's past glories. The second line was a coronation. It was not meant as an insult, but as the pure, unvarnished arithmetic of their awe. In their minds, the scale of the deliverance, one boy against the champion who had paralyzed an army, simply eclipsed all that had come before. David heard the song, and a profound discomfort settled over him. The praise was a heavier burden than Saul's bronze armor had ever been. He saw the flicker in the king's eyes when the women sang, the way the royal smile tightened at the corners. He understood the dangerous calculus of comparison. While the people saw a multiplier of tens of thousands, David saw only the singular, unwavering hand of God. He deflected the praise, not with false humility, but with the sincere and urgent insistence. To any who would listen, he repeated the same truth he had declared to Goliath. The battle was the Lord's. The victory was the Lord's. The glory was the Lord's. He was but a shepherd who had answered a call, his sling an instrument, his faith a conduit. He sought no courtly position, no special honors, wanting only to return to the quiet fields where his identity was rooted in service, not in song. But the melody of the women's refrain had already been etched into the soul of the king. Each repetition was a whetstone, sharpening the sliver of jealousy into a razor's edge. Saul listened, and where David heard a hymn to God, Saul heard a coronation anthem for a rival. The praise that had once been his alone was now divided, and the larger share was flowing to this ruddy youth. The prophecy of Samuel, which had been a vague dread, now took on the sharp, specific features of David's face. The boy's very humility felt like a subtle rebuke, his piety a mirror reflecting Saul's own spiritual failings. The envy, once a hidden worry, began to grow, twisting inward, feeding on suspicion and poisoned gratitude. It was no longer a shadow, but a living thing, coiled in the king's heart, its venom slowly seeping into his thoughts, turning the hero of Israel into the primary threat to his throne. The song of the women, meant to unite a nation in celebration, had instead drawn the battle lines for a new, more intimate war, one that would be waged not in a valley, but in the corridors of power and the dark corners of a king's mind. Chapter 24. Lessons of Faith. The clamor of celebration had faded, the last echoes of the women's songs swallowed by the quiet hum of the camp settling into an unfamiliar peace. David found a moment of solitude on a small rise overlooking the Valley of Elah, the place where terror had so recently reigned. The air, once thick with dread, now felt light, almost holy. He looked out at the field where he had stood alone before a giant, and the memory was not of fear, but of a profound, crystalline certainty that had held him steady. Soldiers began to gather around him, their faces no longer pale with anxiety, but alight with a new hungry curiosity. They had seen the impossible, and they needed to understand the source of the power that had made it possible. They saw not just a victor, but a teacher. David's voice was calm, his words measured as he began to share the truth that had been the bedrock of his life. He spoke not of the size of the stone or the speed of his swing, but of the nature of the battle itself. He explained that the Lord does not see as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, the height of a giant, the gleam of bronze armor, the strength of a trained warrior. But God, he said, looks upon the heart. The most formidable weapon in the Valley of Elah had not been a spear or a sword, but a heart fully trusting in the faithfulness of its God. The giant's size was an illusion of power, his armor a testament to human frailty. True strength, David taught, was found in a spirit surrendered to the divine will, a faith that rendered human measurements of power utterly irrelevant. He wove the story of his own life into the lesson, painting a picture of the quiet fields of Bethlehem. He described himself not as a warrior in training, but as a simple shepherd, a boy whose greatest concerns were green pastures and still waters. His battles had been against predators, not armies, but the principle was the same. He recounted the lion and the bear not as feats of personal bravery, but as divine tutorials in trust. Each rescue, each deliverance in the wilderness had been a stone laid upon the foundation of his faith, teaching him that the same God who watched over a single lamb would surely defend the flock of his people Israel. The sling in his hand was not a weapon of war, but the tool of his trade, and his trust was not in the tool, but in the master who wielded it through him. He was merely a shepherd boy, but his God was the Lord of hosts, and that was the only qualification that mattered. His words, simple and direct, fell upon the listeners like rain on parched ground. They saw their own fear reflected in his story, the fear that had made them see only Goliath's stature and their own inadequacy. They had forgotten to factor God into the equation. David's testimony was a recalibration of their souls, a reminder that the battle is never won by human might or power, but by the Spirit of the Lord. A new understanding dawned in their eyes, a fire of inspired faith kindled by his witness. They saw that the victory in the valley was not an anomaly, but an illustration of an eternal principle, that God chooses the weak things of the world to confound the strong, that he delights in using willing, trusting hearts to accomplish his great purposes. The shepherd boy from Bethlehem had not just felled a giant. He had planted a seed of audacious faith in the heart of a nation, teaching them that with God, a stone and a sling are more than enough, for the victory belongs to him, and he will always fight for those who put their trust in him. Chapter 25. A new beginning. The road back to Bethlehem was the same one he had traveled just days before, the same dusty path winding through the same sun-baked hills, yet everything was irrevocably altered. The parcel of bread and cheese was gone, replaced by the invisible, heavy mantle of a nation's hope. The quiet thoughts of a shepherd boy were now the profound reflections of a man who had stared into the face of a giant and seen only the outstretched hand of God. He walked alone, but the solitude was different now. It was no longer the peaceful isolation of the fields, but the singular space occupied by one whose life had been hijacked by destiny. The bleating of his father's sheep, the feel of a smooth stone in his palm, the simple rhythm of days governed by sunrise and sunset. These were memories from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. He was returning home, but there would be no return to the life he had known. As he crested the final hill and saw the familiar rooftops of Bethlehem nestled in the valley below, a profound wave of nostalgia washed over him, so sharp it was almost a physical pain. He saw the olive grove where he had napped in the heat of the day, the specific outcrop of rock where he had practiced his sling for hours, the very spot by the stream where he had selected the 5 stones. Each landmark was a ghost from a simpler time, a poignant echo of an innocence that was now lost. The town, when he entered it, was not quiet. Word had flown ahead of him, faster than his own footsteps. The people poured from their houses, their faces alight with a fervent, almost frightening adoration. They reached out to touch his cloak, their voices a cacophony of praise and wonder. They saw the giant slayer, the hero of Israel. They did not see the boy who missed the quiet companionship of his flock, who longed for the uncomplicated peace of a starry night with only the sheep for company. That night, lying on the familiar pallet in his father's house, the silence was a loud, empty space filled with the echoes of roaring giants and cheering armies. The faith that had carried him through the valley was still there, a steady flame in his heart, but it now illuminated a frightening and uncertain path. He had learned the ultimate lesson in the dust of Elah, that God's economy values not human strength, but a willing heart. He had seen that the Almighty delights in using the weak to shame the strong, the foolish things to confound the wise. A shepherd's staff was mightier than a king's sword when wielded by faith. This truth was his anchor, but it was also his compass, pointing toward a future he could not yet see. The shadow of King Saul's jealousy, the weight of the people's expectations, the haunting melody of David, his tens of thousands. These were not the trials of a shepherd. They were the birth pangs of a king. He closed his eyes, the scent of the field still clinging to his clothes, and knew with a chilling certainty that the battle with Goliath had been the end of his boyhood and the brutal, glorious beginning of a story whose next chapters would be written not in the peaceful pastures of Bethlehem, but in the treacherous courts of kings and the lonely wilderness of exile, all orchestrated by the God who uses willing hearts, not human strength, to achieve his great and mysterious purposes.